Raj Mankad.
Talk to you about what I think differentiates sort of bad or mediocre cities from great cities. So in the last 10 years, there's been this surge of interest in walkable cities, walkable urbanism, and that's really great news because walking, it's good for our health, it's good for air quality, it's good for the environment, it's good for local economies. But I'm going to offer a friendly critique of the way we define and imagine the walkable city. I work at an architecture school, and I have a PhD, but my PhD isn't in sociology. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an architect. I studied novels and poetry for about 10 years. But what I do at the school is write and edit articles about architecture and urban planning, and specifically Houston. And that's the weird thing, right? It's not as if Houston is admired around the world for being a walkable city, right? We're the whipping boy of urban planners all across the country. And here we are in Sugarland, right? The land of cul-de-sacs and freeways and gigantic parking lots. But I actually think this is the perfect place to think about how walkability should be defined and thought of. Because if we can figure it out here, then we can unlock the potential of cities all over the country, all over the world, especially places that were built after World War II when cars became so dominant. Okay, well, let's talk about how people think of walkability now. It tends to be about being able to do your errands without getting into a car. So let me tell you about this website called WalkScore. What you do is you put in an address, and then it measures the distance between that spot and all of the shops in the area, and then it looks at other amenities, it looks at the number of intersections and the size of the blocks, and it takes all this data, and it puts it through an algorithm, and then it tells you a rating, and it gives you a map. So if you live in a place that's within a quarter mile of a lot of shops and it has short blocks and a lot of intersections, then the website tells you that you're in a pedestrian paradise. It's great, actually. It's a wonderful tool. You should check it out. I use it all the time. But it also troubles me because it really privileges consumerism. It equates the good city with buying stuff. And I just don't think that walkability is the same thing as shopability, right? Now, let's try to think of a more deep definition of walkability. One of the great gurus on the subject is this guy named Jeff Speck. Gave a great TED Talk, a wonderful book, Walkable City. His definition is that a place is walkable if that walk is safe, comfortable, interesting, and useful. It's a good definition. That is the kind of neighborhood that I want to live in, and I would like to see more of those. He calls it a general theory of walkability, and I think it's pretty good, but I would like to add more to it. I'd like to make it more expansive. Okay, so what I would like to suggest is that a walkable city is an intimate city. And what do I mean by that? Okay, if I was going to make a metric of my own, I would use the sneeze test. Just imagine you're walking down the street and you sneeze. I would want to measure whether people said, "bless you," all right? Because that would be a basic indication of whether people were afraid of each other, where there was at least some connection between people. You don't have to be best friends with all of your neighbors, but at least some sense of community. Or what if somebody grew vegetables in their backyard and they put them in a basket and they walked across their cul-de-sac, knocked on their neighbor's door and just gave it to them and there was no money exchanged? That wouldn't show up in the WalkScore metrics. And it won't show up anywhere. I can't make this metric. It's impossible, right? I won't be able to make a website, but I still think it's important to have this thought experiment, to think it through. Okay, I need to tell you a little bit about how I grew up so you get a sense of why is this so important to me? Why would I pick intimacy? So I was a kid in Alabama, in Mobile, Alabama in the 1980s. I was part of that first cohort of Indian Americans in the Deep South. It was me and Bobby Jindal, basically. Yeah. And, some people changed their names, and some people changed their religions, and it was difficult. I have a lot of sympathy for him, even though I completely disagree with everything. But it was really, really difficult to grow up in that time. I felt, alienated, and I even, as an adult, I have this constant yearning to belong to a community. So now I live in Houston. It's a fantastically diverse place, but it's also an atomized place, which is basically, what I mean is, you can go from your air-conditioned house into your garage, and then you get in your car, and then you drive to another air-conditioned garage, and you get out, and then you go into your office, and you interact with some people, and you might have some diversity in your life, but basically, you're kind of moving from bubble to bubble to bubble. But I have refused that life, I don't drive unless I really have to. I share a car with my wife, and I take the bus or the train, or I walk or I bicycle. And, the really wonderful thing about, most of the time on the bus, people have their headphones and Pokemon, and, they don't talk but sometimes, it's not very hard to start up a conversation. You just say, hey, where are you going? And then all of a sudden, you've heard somebody's life story. I've met waiters, I've met engineers at oil companies, I've met black folks and white folks and Latinos, and even once I sat next to this elderly woman who reminded me of my grandmother, my dadi, and I helped her figure out the directions to a temple. One time, I was waiting at a bus stop, and there was this guy with big, broad shoulders and a beard. He was a white guy, and he looked like he could pick me up and snap me in two, But we started talking, and he's a longshoreman, which to me is like this mythical figure. It's so fascinating to talk to him. He told me all about the port and what it's like to load and unload these giant ships. And he said, look, I've got a good job. It's union. I get paid pretty well. But he'd hit a rough spot. He didn't have a car at that time. So even though he had the job, he couldn't get to it, right? And that's why I think it's important to talk about equity. Okay, so I talked about intimacy, connection, belonging, community, and now I'm talking about equity. So, I think it's great if I can walk to a neighborhood cafe and, meet up with friends. That's important to me. But, it's truly fundamental that this man be able to get to his job, right? Or if somebody uses a wheelchair, they truly need to have a barrier-free way to get around the city so they're not isolated. That's a basic civil right? So that's what I mean by equity. Okay, now, if you're with me, if you believe that equity is a central tenet to a good city, to a great city, to a walkable city, then you have to think about all different kinds of neighborhoods. Now, 30 years ago, I remember we would use the word inner city and poverty interchangeably, right? But nowadays, there's this big interest in, living in the center, and there's a lot more affluent people moving in, and poverty is increasingly dispersed across this giant, sprawling place. So, when you think of the 8% of people in this region who, the 8% of households that don't have cars, there's a disproportionate number of them in neighborhoods like Galveston and Greenspoint. These are places that were built in the 70s, these giant apartment complexes on super blocks. They were built for people who had cars, but now they're full of immigrant families, often refugees, and there are children there who have a really hard time accessing the basic amenities that a lot of us take for granted. So if we believe in equity, we can't just focus on the antique neighborhoods, the old gridded streets that are built around streetcars, before World War II. So we need to think about intimacy and equity all across the city in many different kinds of neighborhoods. So what is the solution? What can we do? All right, well, there's all kinds of things. We could build more light rail or BRT. We could have two-way commuter buses on the managed lanes running all day. We could have more frequent bus lines that feed into this backbone. You know, in the next few years, probably sooner than we think, there'll be autonomous vehicles that can serve low-density areas like this one in a pretty cost-effective manner and feed people into higher capacity systems. We can also have green infrastructure, which is something we're already doing. So those brown lines I'm showing represent the bayous that course through this region. And we already have this amazing program called the Bayou Greenways, and we're putting 100 miles of trail connecting across this city. And they run east-west, but now we're starting to look at ways to connect those north and south along utility corridors and ditches. And we can connect those to on-street bike lanes and have protected paths for cyclists. So there's green infrastructure, gray infrastructure, there's high tech, there's low tech. We could expand bicycle sharing and car sharing. There's all kinds of possibilities. And we can rely on experts, the kind of people that I interview and work with at the School of Architecture, to help us get there, to help us design beautiful buildings that activate places. But it's also important that we honor our own experiences and think about what is already working in places. When I was in Mobile, I grew up on a cul-de-sac, and you know, my dadi, my grandmother, was really isolated. She wasn't able to get anywhere by herself, and she was pretty lonely. But you know, at least I could ride my bike with my friends, and we found this path to this like ditch, and it was covered with this like gooey algae stuff, and it was really disgusting in a cool way. We'd get our bikes down there, and we'd ride through there, and we could come through this tunnel and come out and get to this ice cream shop. So you know, it was this wonderful adventure. And those are the kinds of like local knowledges that we can build on. And you know, the fascinating thing was during one of the breaks for this TEDx, I talked to a lot of people who live in Sugarland, and some of these things are already happening here, right? There are more trails being built. So this is already starting to come to life. I even met somebody who lives in a neighborhood of cul-de-sacs, and he made sure he picked a house where his kids could bicycle to school, and he has a home office, and he orders a lot of his goods through Amazon Prime. And so, you know, if you have an expansive enough definition, then you can at least recognize that this person who lives in Sugarland in a cul-de-sac neighborhood has actually carved out a more walkable life than a lot of people who live in the center of the city. All right, I'm going to end with this photograph from Houston. This is actually pretty close in. This is from an event called Sunday Streets, and I played a role in having this program launched. I was a volunteer, and what happens is the city closes a stretch of street to cars and opens it up to pedestrians and cyclists, to active transportation. It's just a temporary thing, right? 3 hours, but it allows us to, imagine a different kind of city, a different future. And the interesting thing about this particular part of Houston is, at one time it did have a lot of little shops, and it was walkable in that classical sense. But after years of highways carving through the neighborhood and disinvestment and systematic discrimination, there are a lot of vacant lots. But there's also this committed group of community activists and organizers and artists. There's Project Row Houses led by Rick Lowe. They have these artist installations. And, there's also these markets and this beautiful girl jump roping. None of this would register in WalkScore. If you go to WalkScore, you won't see this listed as a walking paradise or a pedestrian paradise. But I submit to you that this is a model, right? This is a model for the great city, for the intimate city, for the walkable city, for the equitable city. And with all of your help, and with experts, all of us together, we can create more models in neighborhoods all across this sprawling place. we don't want to expand out any further, but we can create models inside the city, we can create models in these 1970s apartment blocks, and we can do it even in this beautiful land of cul-de-sacs. Thanks.